The massive frame of Ezekiel "Big Zeke" Thompson cast a shadow across the dusty main street of Millbrook as he made his weekly trip to town for supplies, his 7-foot height and enormous shoulders making even the largest building seem somehow smaller in comparison. The 45-year-old rancher moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be conscious of his size in a world built for smaller people. But there was nothing he could do about the way conversations stopped and whispers began whenever he appeared in public. Zeke's appearance was indeed striking beyond mere size. His hands were so large they could palm a man's head like a melon. His voice rumbled like distant thunder even when he spoke softly, and his weathered face bore scars from a lifetime of hard work and harder experiences that he never discussed with anyone. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart from other men, pale blue orbs that held depths of sadness and secrets that seemed to carry the weight of untold suffering. "Look at the size of that monster," whispered Mrs. Agnes Hartwell to her companion as they watched Zeke carefully navigate the narrow aisles of Morrison's general store, his massive frame requiring him to duck under hanging lanterns and turn sideways to fit between displays. "I heard he can lift a full-grown bull with his bare hands, and that he once killed 3 men in a single fight back east before he came here." The rumors that followed Zeke wherever he went had grown increasingly elaborate over the 5 years since he'd arrived in Millbrook and purchased the struggling Broken Creek Ranch, transforming it through back-breaking labor into one of the most successful operations in 3 counties. But success had not brought him acceptance or friendship, only increased speculation about the mysterious giant who lived alone in the hills and seemed to carry secrets that made even hardened frontier men uncomfortable. "I don't care how much money he's got," muttered Jake Peterson, the town's blacksmith, as Zeke approached the counter with his carefully written list of supplies. "There's something unnatural about a man that size. Probably has devil's blood in him, which would explain why he keeps to himself and never sets foot in church." The cruel speculation was spoken just loudly enough for Zeke to hear, as it always was, but his only response was a slight tightening around his eyes as he handed his list to store owner Tom Morrison with the kind of quiet dignity that had characterized all his interactions with the townspeople, who seemed determined to view him as a freak rather than a fellow human being. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Zeke said in his deep, careful voice, making a conscious effort to speak softly so as not to startle anyone with the rumbling bass that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his massive chest. "I hope you and your family are well." Tom Morrison, one of the few people in town who treated Zeke with basic courtesy, nodded respectfully as he reviewed the supply list. "Morning, Zeke. How are things out at Broken Creek? I heard you brought in another prize bull from back east." "Yes, sir," Zeke replied, his face showing a brief flash of the pride he took in his successful ranching operation. "Scottish Highland stock should improve the bloodlines considerably and help the local ranchers who are willing to pay the breeding fees." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Mayor William Cartwright, a pompous man whose political ambitions had made him sensitive to what he perceived as the image problem that Zeke's presence created for their community. Cartwright had been campaigning for months to encourage Zeke to sell his ranch and move somewhere more suitable for someone of his unusual characteristics. "Thompson," Mayor Cartwright said, with the kind of false heartiness that barely concealed his hostility, "I've been meaning to speak with you about the upcoming Harvest Festival. Some of the organizing committee members have expressed concerns about your participation in community events." The carefully worded insult hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire, and Zeke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he processed the latest attempt to make him feel unwelcome in the town, where he had tried to build a life. "I wasn't planning to participate, Mayor Cartwright," Zeke replied quietly, his voice carrying no trace of the anger that anyone else would have shown at such treatment. I understand that my presence makes people uncomfortable, and I have no wish to spoil anyone's enjoyment of the festivities." "Well, that's very considerate of you," the mayor stammered, clearly having expected an argument rather than dignified acceptance of the community's rejection. As Zeke gathered his supplies and prepared to load them into his oversized wagon, specifically built to accommodate his unusual proportions, the sound of running footsteps and frightened voices began to echo from the direction of the school. Through the store windows, they could see people gathering in the street, their expressions showing the kind of alarm that indicated a genuine emergency rather than mere gossip. "Fire!" someone shouted from outside. "The schoolhouse is on fire, and there are children trapped inside." The words sent everyone in the store rushing toward the door, but it was Zeke who moved with the most purpose, his massive stride carrying him ahead of the smaller men despite their head start. As they reached the scene, the situation became terrifyingly clear. The one-room schoolhouse was engulfed in flames, with thick smoke pouring from the windows and the sound of children's screams coming from inside the burning building. The roof collapsed and blocked the main door, shouted Teacher Mary Sullivan, her face streaked with tears and soot as she tried desperately to reach her trapped students. "Little Timothy Martin is still inside, and I can't get to him. The flames are too high." The crowd of adults stood helplessly outside the burning building, their faces showing the agony of people who wanted to help but lacked the physical capability to breach the wall of fire that separated them from the trapped child. The volunteer fire brigade was still minutes away, and everyone understood that those minutes might be too long for a small boy surrounded by smoke and flame. Without a word, Zeke pushed through the crowd and approached the burning building, his pale eyes studying the structure with the kind of analytical calm that had served him well in previous emergencies that he never discussed with anyone. The main door was indeed blocked by burning debris, but there was a window on the side of the building that might be accessible to someone with sufficient size and strength. "Stand back," Zeke said quietly, his voice carrying easily over the crackling of flames and the shouts of the crowd. "I'm going in. You can't," Mayor Cartwright protested, though whether from concern for Zeke's safety or fear of the liability implications was unclear. "The building could collapse at any moment. It's too dangerous." Zeke's response was to remove his heavy coat and wrap it around his head and shoulders, then approach the side window with the kind of determined purpose that suggested he had faced similar situations before. His massive hands gripped the window frame, and with a single powerful motion, he tore the entire window assembly from the wall, creating an opening large enough for his enormous frame. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the giant who had been ridiculed and ostracized for years disappeared into the burning building, risking his life to save a child who belonged to people who had never shown him anything but cruelty and suspicion. The seconds that followed felt like hours, as everyone strained to hear sounds from inside the inferno, hoping for some sign that both Zeke and the boy were still alive. When Zeke finally emerged from the smoke-filled building, his clothes smoking, and his face blackened with soot, he carried 7-year-old Timothy Martin in his arms like a precious bundle. The boy was unconscious from smoke inhalation, but clearly breathing, and the sight of his rescue brought cheers from the crowd that had moments earlier been discussing Zeke's monstrous nature. "Get him to Dr. Patterson immediately," Zeke said, as he gently transferred the child to his teacher's arms, his voice hoarse from smoke, but still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. "He's inhaled a lot of smoke, but I think he'll be all right with proper care." As the crowd began to disperse and Timothy was rushed to medical attention, people looked at Zeke with expressions that mixed gratitude with confusion, as if they couldn't reconcile the heroic actions they had just witnessed with the frightening giant they had been taught to fear and distrust. But it was 10-year-old Jimmy Patterson, Dr. Patterson's son, who approached Zeke with the kind of innocent directness that only children possessed, his young face showing none of the fear or suspicion that characterized adult reactions to the rancher's presence. "Mr. Thompson, Jimmy," said quietly, tugging on Zeke's massive hand to get his attention, "are you really a monster like the grown-ups say? Because monsters don't save children from fires, do they?" The simple question from an innocent child seemed to strike Zeke with unexpected force, and for just a moment his carefully controlled expression showed a flash of pain so deep and raw that several adults who witnessed it felt their own assumptions about his character beginning to shift. "No, son," Zeke said gently, kneeling down to Jimmy's level despite the obvious discomfort that movement caused his smoke-damaged lungs. "Monsters don't save children. But sometimes good people get called monsters because others don't understand them." The exchange between the giant and the child created a moment of uncomfortable silence as the adults present began to realize that their treatment of Zeke might have been based more on prejudice than genuine knowledge of his character. But before anyone could respond, Jimmy asked the question that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the mysterious rancher. "Mr. Thompson," the boy said with the relentless curiosity that characterized childhood, "why do you have those marks on your wrists? They look like the scars Papa showed me from when bad men kept him chained up during the war." The innocent question from 10-year-old Jimmy Patterson about the scars on Zeke's wrists created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch across the entire crowd, as if the boy's words had frozen time itself. Everyone present had noticed the marks that ringed Zeke's massive wrists like permanent bracelets, but no one had possessed either the courage or the innocence to ask directly about their origin. Now, faced with a child's guileless curiosity, Zeke found himself confronting memories he had spent 5 years trying to bury in hard work and solitary living. Zeke's pale eyes showed a flash of something that might have been panic as he realized that his carefully guarded secrets were about to be exposed by the observant questions of a child who saw the world without the filters of adult prejudice and assumption. For a moment, he seemed to consider deflecting the question or simply walking away, but something in Jimmy's earnest expression convinced him that honesty might be preferable to continued speculation. "Jimmy," Dr. Patterson said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with his son's direct approach to such a sensitive topic, "that's not an appropriate question to ask Mr. Thompson. Some things are private." "It's all right, Doctor," Zeke said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had finally reached a decision that had been years in the making. "The boy has a right to ask, especially after what happened here today. Maybe it's time people knew the truth instead of making up their own stories." The crowd that had been dispersing began to gather again, drawn by the promise of finally learning the truth about the mysterious giant who had lived among them for 5 years without ever revealing anything about his past or the circumstances that had brought him to their remote frontier community. Zeke slowly rolled up his sleeves, revealing the full extent of the scars that had partially inspired the rumors about his violent past. The marks were indeed consistent with prolonged restraint, deep grooves in his flesh that spoke of metal bands worn for extended periods under conditions that had clearly involved struggle and resistance. "These scars," Zeke said quietly, his voice carrying across the crowd with the kind of authority that made even the skeptics listen carefully, "came from 5 years of being chained like an animal in Blackwood's traveling circus, where I was displayed as the mountain giant and forced to perform feats of strength for the entertainment of crowds who paid money to gawk at human curiosities." The revelation hit the assembled townspeople like a physical blow, as they began to understand that the man they had feared and ridiculed had himself been the victim of exploitation and abuse that reduced him to the status of a sideshow attraction, rather than a human being worthy of dignity and respect. The circus owner, Silas Blackwood, purchased me from an orphanage when I was 16, Zeke continued, his voice growing stronger as he finally gave voice to experiences that had haunted him for decades. I was already larger than most grown men, and he saw an opportunity to make money from my unusual size. For 5 years, I was kept in chains except when performing, fed barely enough to maintain my strength, and treated like property rather than a person. Mayor Cartwright shifted uncomfortably as he began to realize that his attempts to drive Zeke from their community had been directed at someone who had already suffered more persecution than any human being should have to endure. "How did you escape?" asked Mary Sullivan, the schoolteacher whose student Zeke had just saved, her voice filled with the kind of compassion that had been notably absent from most of the community's previous interactions with him. "I didn't escape," Zeke replied, with a bitter smile that held no warmth. "Blackwood died of a heart attack during a performance in Kansas City, and his creditors sold off the circus assets to pay his debts. I was legally freed because slavery had been abolished, but I had no money, no education beyond what I had managed to teach myself, and no place in a world that saw me as a freak rather than a person." The crowd listened in stunned silence as Zeke described the years that followed his release from the circus, the desperate search for work that wouldn't exploit his size, the constant rejection and suspicion he faced from people who couldn't see past his physical appearance to the intelligent, gentle man underneath. "I worked whatever jobs I could find," Zeke continued, "mostly loading cargo on riverboats, where my strength was useful and my appearance was less likely to frighten customers. I saved every penny for 10 years, learning to read and write in my spare time, studying agriculture and animal husbandry from books I bought with money that should have gone for food." Dr. Patterson stepped forward, his medical training allowing him to see details that others might miss. "Those scars show signs of infection and poor healing," he observed quietly. "You received no medical care during your captivity, did you?" Blackwood considered medical care an unnecessary expense for property that could be replaced if it broke, Zeke replied matter-of-factly, though his voice carried undertones of pain that went far beyond physical suffering. "I learned to treat my own injuries as best I could, which is why the scars are so prominent." Young Jimmy, whose innocent question had started this revelation, looked up at Zeke with eyes that held none of the fear that had characterized adult reactions to the giant's presence. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "were you scared all that time? Did you cry?" The child's direct question about emotions struck Zeke more powerfully than any of the adult's inquiries about facts and circumstances. "Yes, Jimmy," he said gently. "I was scared most of the time, and yes, I cried, though I tried not to let anyone see because showing weakness made the treatment worse." Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, who had been one of the most vocal critics of Zeke's presence in their community, found herself struggling with shame as she realized that her gossip and speculation had been directed at someone whose suffering exceeded anything in her own comfortable experience. "Mr. Thompson," she said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been treating you based on ignorance and prejudice instead of trying to understand who you really are." "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Hartwell," Zeke replied with a dignity that impressed everyone present. "People fear what they don't understand, and I've never given anyone reason to understand me better. Perhaps that's been as much my mistake as anyone else's." Tom Morrison, the store owner who had been one of Zeke's few sources of civil treatment, stepped forward with obvious determination. "Zeke," he said firmly, "from now on, anyone who wants to do business in my store will treat you with the respect you deserve. No more whispers, no more cruel speculation. You've more than earned your place in this community." The sentiment was echoed by several other voices in the crowd as people began to process the full implications of what they had learned about the man they had spent 5 years misunderstanding and mistreating. "There's something else," Zeke said quietly, his voice showing the strain of revealing secrets he had guarded for so long. "Something that explains why I've been so reluctant to get close to anyone, especially children." The crowd fell silent. Again, sensing that another revelation was coming that might be even more significant than what they had already heard. "During my time with the circus," Zeke continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "there was another performer, a little girl named Sarah, who had been born with a facial deformity that made her valuable as a sideshow attraction. She was only 8 years old when I first met her, and she had no family except the other performers who were as powerless as she was." Zeke's voice broke slightly as he continued, and several people in the crowd found themselves wiping away tears as they anticipated the tragedy that his tone suggested was coming. "Sarah became like a daughter to me," Zeke said, his massive hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled with emotions that were clearly still raw after all these years. "I tried to protect her from the worst of Blackwood's cruelty, sharing my food with her when she was being punished, comforting her when she cried from loneliness and fear." "What happened to her?" Mary Sullivan asked gently, though her voice suggested she dreaded the answer. "She died of pneumonia during a cold winter in Nebraska," Zeke replied, his voice breaking completely as he finally gave voice to the loss that had shaped every day of his life since. "Blackwood refused to pay for medical care, said she wasn't worth the expense of a doctor. I held her in my arms while she died, promising her that someday I would find a way to help other children so they wouldn't have to suffer like she did." The revelation of Zeke's tragic loss and his motivation for the heroic rescue they had just witnessed transformed the crowd's understanding of his character completely. This wasn't a monster or a freak, but a man whose enormous capacity for love had been shaped by profound loss and who had spent years looking for ways to honor the memory of a little girl who had died in his arms. "That's why you saved Timothy," Jimmy said with the clarity that only children possessed, "because you promised Sarah you would help children." "Yes," Zeke said simply, kneeling down to Jimmy's level and allowing the boy to see the tears that he had held back for so many years. "Every child I can help is a way of keeping that promise." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Zeke individually to offer apologies, invitations, and expressions of gratitude that had been 5 years overdue. But it was the sight of Jimmy Patterson reaching up to take one of Zeke's massive hands in his own small one that seemed to affect the giant most powerfully, suggesting that the walls he had built around his heart might finally be ready to come down. Subscribe to our channel now to see how this incredible revelation transforms both Zeke's life and the entire community. Don't miss the final chapter of this amazing story. 6 months had passed since the schoolhouse fire, and Zeke's revelation about his tragic past and the transformation in both his relationship with the Millbrook community and his own sense of belonging was remarkable to witness. The man who had once been feared and ridiculed was now sought out for advice, invited to community gatherings, and treated with the respect that his character and actions had always deserved. But perhaps most importantly, the Broken Creek Ranch had become a sanctuary for children who needed the kind of protection and understanding that only someone who had suffered similar experiences could provide. Jimmy Patterson had become a regular visitor to the ranch, his natural curiosity and fearless acceptance of Zeke's unusual appearance, making him the perfect bridge between the giant and the community that was still learning to see past physical differences to character and heart. The boys' weekly visits had evolved into informal lessons about ranching, reading, and life philosophy that benefited both teacher and student in ways that went far beyond mere education. "Mr. Zeke," Jimmy said one autumn afternoon as they worked together repairing fence posts, using the informal address that had developed naturally over months of growing friendship, Why do you think some grown-ups are so afraid of people who look different? You're the nicest person I know, but it took them so long to figure that out. The question demonstrated the kind of thoughtful intelligence that had made Jimmy such a perceptive observer of adult behavior, and Zeke considered his response carefully as he lifted a fence post that would have required 3 normal men to move. "I think, Jimmy," Zeke said slowly, "that fear of differences comes from not understanding that what's inside a person matters more than what they look like on the outside. People who haven't learned that lesson yet sometimes make mistakes that hurt others, but that doesn't make them bad people, just people who need to learn better." The generous interpretation of his former tormentor's behavior was characteristic of Zeke's approach to forgiveness, an attitude that had impressed everyone who had gotten to know him since his revelation about his past. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a wagon approaching the ranch at high speed, clearly bearing urgent news or passengers in need of immediate assistance. As the vehicle drew closer, they could see Dr. Patterson driving, with his wife and what appeared to be 2 small children huddled in the back under heavy blankets. "Zeke," Dr. Patterson called out as he pulled up to the ranch house, "I need your help with a situation that I think you'll understand better than anyone else in the territory." Zeke immediately set aside his work and approached the wagon, his trained eye quickly assessing that the children appeared to be in distress rather than merely tired from travel. Mrs. Patterson was holding what looked like a girl of perhaps 6 years old, while a boy who might have been 8 sat quietly beside them with the kind of unnaturally still behavior that suggested trauma or serious illness. "What's the situation, Doctor?" Zeke asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling emergencies with calm efficiency. "These children were rescued from a traveling show that was passing through Cedar Falls," Dr. Patterson explained, his voice tight with anger and professional concern. "They were being exhibited as curiosities and kept in conditions that amount to imprisonment and abuse." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow, awakening memories of his own captivity and the suffering he had witnessed in others who were exploited for their differences. But more than personal pain, he felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven him to save Timothy from the burning schoolhouse. "What kind of conditions?" Zeke asked quietly, though his clenched fist suggested he already suspected. The answer: caged like animals, fed barely enough to survive, and displayed for the entertainment of crowds who paid to stare at their deformities, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice breaking with emotion as she described conditions that she could barely comprehend. "The girl has a cleft palate that can be surgically corrected, and the boy has a withered arm that doesn't affect his health, but makes him valuable as a sideshow attraction." Zeke knelt down beside the wagon, his massive frame somehow managing to appear non-threatening as he studied the 2 children with the kind of understanding that could only come from shared experience. "What are your names?" he asked gently, his voice carrying none of the commanding presence he used with adults and all of the warmth he had once reserved for little Sarah during their captivity together. "I'm Lucy," the girl whispered, her speech slightly affected by her cleft palate but clearly understandable. "And this is my brother Ben. Are you going to put us in a cage too?" The innocent question about whether Zeke intended to continue their exploitation revealed just how thoroughly the children's trust in adult kindness had been destroyed by their experiences, and he felt his heart breaking for these little ones, who had suffered treatment similar to what he had endured. "No, Lucy," Zeke said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that helped frightened children believe in the possibility of safety. "Nobody is ever going to put you in a cage again. You're going to live in a real house with real beds and regular meals and people who care about you because you're precious children, not because of how you look." Dr. Patterson exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife, both of them recognizing that Zeke's unique background and demonstrated capacity for caring made him the ideal person to help these children heal from their traumatic experiences. "Zeke," Dr. Patterson said carefully, "the territorial authorities are looking for suitable placement for these children, but their special needs make conventional foster care complicated. Would you consider—" "Yes," Zeke interrupted, his decision made before the question was even fully asked. "They can stay here as long as they need to, permanently, if that's what's best for them. This ranch has plenty of room and plenty of love for children who need both." Mrs. Patterson began to cry with relief as she realized that Lucy and Ben had found exactly the kind of caregiver they needed. Someone who understood their experiences and possessed both the resources and the character necessary to help them heal and thrive. Over the following weeks, as Lucy and Ben gradually settled into life at the Broken Creek Ranch, their transformation was remarkable to witness. Zeke's gentle patience and understanding of trauma helped them begin to trust adults again, while his obvious strength and protective presence made them feel safe for the first time in their young lives. "Mr. Zeke," Ben said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "Jimmy Patterson told me that people used to be mean to you because you're so big. Did that make you sad?" "Yes, Ben," Zeke replied honestly. "It made me very sad. But it also taught me that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. What matters is that you know you're a good person, even when others don't understand that yet." Lucy, whose speech had already begun to improve under the care of specialists that Zeke had brought in from Denver, climbed onto his lap with the fearless affection that had characterized her approach to their relationship from the beginning. "Are we going to be your children forever?" she asked with the direct curiosity that seemed to run in Millbrook's young population. "If you want to be," Zeke replied gently, "then yes, you'll be my children forever. Family isn't about blood or looking the same, Lucy. It's about choosing to love each other and take care of each other no matter what." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of multiple wagons approaching the ranch, carrying what appeared to be most of Millbrook's adult population, along with children, food, and various supplies. As they drew closer, Zeke could see that this was some kind of organized gathering rather than a casual visit. "Zeke Thompson," called out Mayor Cartwright, as he climbed down from the lead wagon, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had characterized their previous interactions. "We've come to offer you our formal apologies, and to ask if you would consider accepting the position of Millbrook's first child welfare officer." The proposal was completely unexpected, representing not just recognition of Zeke's character but official acknowledgement of his unique qualifications for protecting children who might not fit conventional community standards. "The territorial government has authorized us to create the position specifically for you," explained Tom Morrison, "with a salary and official authority to investigate situations where children might be at risk. Your experience and your demonstrated commitment to child welfare make you the obvious choice." Dr. Patterson stepped forward with a document bearing official seals and signatures. "The position would allow you to travel throughout the territory, identifying children who need help and ensuring they receive appropriate care rather than exploitation." Zeke looked down at Lucy and Ben, then around at the faces of people who had spent years treating him as an outsider, but who were now offering him not just acceptance, but a position of honor and responsibility in their community. "I accept," Zeke said simply, "on the condition that this position is used to help all children who need protection, regardless of their appearance or circumstances." The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with the entire community sharing food, stories, and plans for the work that Zeke would undertake in his new role. But the moment that meant the most to him came when Jimmy Patterson stood up to address the gathering. "Mr. Zeke saved Timothy from the fire," Jimmy announced with the kind of authority that only children possessed. "But he also saved our whole town from being the kind of place that's mean to people who are different. He taught us that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." 2 years later, Zeke's work as child welfare officer had resulted in the rescue of dozens of children from various forms of exploitation throughout the territory, while the Broken Creek Ranch had become a model for innovative foster care that prioritized children's emotional needs alongside their physical welfare. Lucy's cleft palate had been successfully repaired. Ben had learned that his physical difference didn't limit his potential. And both children had thrived under Zeke's patient care and the community's acceptance. But perhaps most importantly, Zeke had finally found peace with his past and purpose for his future, discovering that the suffering he had endured could become the foundation for preventing others from experiencing similar trauma. The giant, who had been ridiculed and feared, had become the most beloved and respected member of his community, proving that heroism often came in unexpected packages, and that the greatest strength was found in using power to protect rather than intimidate. The dark secret that little Jimmy Patterson had helped reveal had indeed transformed everything, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of confirming the community's fears about their mysterious neighbor, it had revealed the depth of his character and the breadth of his capacity for love, creating a legacy of compassion that would protect vulnerable children for generations to come. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of hidden heroes, second chances, and the power of truth to transform fear into understanding. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the triumph of love over prejudice.